In the early 90s, a terminally ill woman is rushed into A&E. She's incoherent, sweating profusely, and has a rapid heartbeat. Her blood pressure has dropped significantly and she's struggling to catch her breath. She's in the third stage of cancer, so doctors naturally assume this is the reason her health is deteriorating so quickly. In a bid to extend her life, doctors get to work straight away. They rip her clothes off and begin to administer medication directly into her bloodstream. To no avail, the patient is losing consciousness. When they realize nothing is working, with no time to lose, in line with procedure, doctors promptly remove her clothes so they can attempt to use a defibrillator. As they do so, they notice the patient's skin is greasy, and a sudden garlic fruity aroma pollutes the air. With no time to spare, the doctors don't give it much thought and continue to work on the patient. But suddenly, out of nowhere, one of the nurses working on the patient feels lightheaded and faints. But as soon as her colleagues attempt to check if she's okay, a second nurse in the room instantly develops breathing difficulties and is unable to catch her breath. Before the other nurses and doctors can even attend to her, a third nurse passes out and hits the floor with a thud. When she comes to, she is unable to move her limbs and can no longer feel her arms and legs. Anyone who touched the patient appeared to have suddenly taken sick. What was going on? Were they to share the same fate? What was causing the staff to spontaneously become ill? Was the patient cursed? On True Crime, we explore murder, mystery, and criminal cases. If that's your kind of thing, please hit the like button and subscribe to this channel. Now let's delve straight into the mysterious death of the so-called toxic lady. On January the 11th, 1963, a beautiful little baby was born. Her parents named her Gloria Cecilia Ramirez. Gloria was born in a city called Riverside, which just happens to be the biggest city in California. Gloria was the youngest of 5 children and grew up in a loving home and a close-knit family, where she had an abundance of love and support. As a child, she was known for her infectious smile and her adventurous spirit. She loved to explore the world around her. She was always keen to learn and experience new things. Unfortunately, on February the 19th, 1994, her life was abruptly cut short, and her death caused a media frenzy that baffled experts until this day. She was dubbed the Toxic Lady by media at the time. But what happened to Gloria? And why was her death such a mystery? Stay tuned as today we explore the strange events that occurred in Gloria's final hours. On February 19, 1994, a 911 operator receives a call from a man, the man being Johnny Estrada, Gloria's boyfriend, doing his best to mask the panic in his tone. He tells the operator he needs an ambulance right now. He reports his girlfriend was suffering from chest pains and having breathing difficulties, to the point she was literally struggling to breathe on her own. Now, as distraught as he was, seeing the love of his life in this condition, it wasn't completely unexpected, as only 6 weeks prior, Gloria had been diagnosed with terminal cervical cancer, and informed she may not have long left to live, as it was in its final stages. Once the ambulance arrived, the medical experts assessed Gloria's situation. It was immediately clear that something was seriously wrong, and Gloria needed to be taken to a hospital for medical treatment right away. Not only was she having breathing difficulties and chest pains, but she was also heavily sweating, and had an irregular heartbeat. The rate in which her heart was beating was so fast, if it kept going at that rate for much longer, Gloria was going to die there and then. With no time to lose, they put Gloria into the back of an ambulance, gave Gloria an oxygen mask, turned on the emergency lights and sirens, and proceeded to drive to the closest hospital as fast as they could. Due to the seriousness of the situation, and with time being of the essence, the ambulance made the decision to call the hospital prior to their arrival, so the hospital staff could prep for their soon-to-be patient. They informed them of Gloria's dire condition and let them know they'll be arriving in the next 10 minutes. Now, even though they understood the gravity of the situation, as I'm sure you can imagine, hospital staff are for the most part accustomed to dealing with sick patients, including those who are in critical condition, so for them it was business as usual. However, no amount of medical training could prepare them for what was about to happen next. The ambulance arrives at Riverside Hospital at 8:15, and they quickly proceed to unload Gloria from the ambulance. She's laying on her back on the stretcher, heartbeat still racing. She's unable to string sentences together that make any sense, but by her groans, it's evident she's still in intense pain. They promptly wheel her into the hospital, where the hospital staff then take charge. 3 members of staff grab the stretcher, 1 grabs the top and 2 on either side. They then begin to power walk, wheeling Gloria through the hospital hallways. They turn left down a hallway, and rush Gloria into Trauma Room 1, the room they had prepared for her arrival. they instantly notice her heart rate is beating extremely fast, and if they do not act fast, heart failure is imminent. The first thing the hospital staff did was swap over the oxygen mask Gloria had been using from the ambulance. They gave her a more powerful one that would deliver oxygen in higher concentrations. They then began treating her, administering a combination of drugs including sedatives and painkillers, in a bid to stabilize her deteriorating condition. Initially, Gloria responded to the treatment well. Her heartbeat began to slow down to a regular rhythm. Her blood pressure was stabilizing. However, before the doctors could breathe a sigh of relief, Gloria's situation took a turn for the worse. The heart monitor machine she was connected to began to alarm and indicate that her heart rate was elevating quickly. The medical staff knew they had to act fast, so they swiftly began to remove Gloria's clothing. As soon as they did so, they instantly noticed two things they found rather peculiar. The first was that Gloria's arms and torso were covered in this thick, oily sheen. The second was that her breath was emitting this pungent garlic odor, with a hint of fruit. Although they made a note of the strange anomalies, they didn't believe it was anything significant, so without a second to spare, they proceeded to work on reducing Gloria's symptoms. A decision would soon prove to have devastating consequences. The medical staff proceed to place the electrical nodes on Gloria's body and begin charging up the defibrillators. They apply the defibrillator pads to her chest, and resume sending bolts of electricity through Gloria's body. As they were doing so, a nurse would attempt to draw blood from Gloria's arm, so they could assess the general state of the patient's health. This was a routine procedure, something she had done hundreds of times before. As she found a suitable vein and stuck a needle in Gloria's arm, the nurse begins to draw blood from the patient. As she does so, the air in the room abruptly begins to fill with another odor. Some nurses described it as smelling like urine, another stated it had a chemical-like smell. One of the nurses who was working on Gloria instantly recognized the smell. A nurse named Julie turned to face the nurse who was drawing the blood from Gloria, and said with a puzzled look on her face, "I think I can smell ammonia." The nurse who had just finished drawing the last bit of blood from Gloria's arm nodded in agreement, and proceeded to pass the blood vial over to Julie. As Julie stretches out and proceeds to take the blood vial from her colleague, she notices her colleague doesn't look too good. She seems to be dazed and confused, and is squinting her eyes in a bid to focus on her surroundings. Julie was just about to check on her colleague to ask if she was okay, when something caught her attention. As she looked down in her hand at the vial of Gloria's blood she was now holding, she noticed the blood was filled with these small white crystals, something she had never seen before in all her time working as a nurse. She glances up to check on her colleague and asks if she has seen anything like this before. However, as soon as she met eyes with her colleague began to collapse. With a stroke of luck, another doctor just so happened to be behind her, so he noticed her collapsing, and grabbed her before she hit the ground. Although her colleagues were concerned about her well-being, they knew they had a patient in critical condition that required their attention, so the nurse was promptly placed onto a stretcher and wheeled out of Trauma Room 1. While this was happening, Julie herself began to feel nauseous. She became lightheaded, and started to feel heavy. Pins and needles started traveling through her legs, as Julie didn't want to cause any more distractions, as she knew Gloria still needed to be saved. As soon as the doctor returned from wheeling her colleague away, Julie exited Trauma Room 1. Found the closest available bench and took a seat. She was exhausted, confused, panting heavily. Another member of staff who worked at that hospital was walking through the hallway when she looked up and noticed Julie sitting down looking visibly uncomfortable. She walked over and commenced to ask Julie if she was okay. Julie looks at her colleague and leans forward. Julie barely utters a word before her eyes roll back in her head and she falls forward, hitting the ground with a thud. The nurse runs over to Julie's limp body lying on the floor, holds Julie in her arms and calls out for help. However, although they were in a hospital, help would take a few minutes to arrive, as what the nurse didn't know, at the same time Julie collapsed, a nightmare was unfolding in Trauma Room 1. As Nurse Julie lay in her colleague's arms unconscious, a third nurse who was still in Trauma Room 1 fainted. A few minutes later so did another. Within no time at all, a total of 6 medical staff had fainted. An unseen force in Trauma 1 seemed to be taking out all the staff members that had been working on Gloria one by one. Nobody knew what was going on. All they knew for sure is whatever was taking place was linked to their patient Gloria. As panic begins to erupt in the emergency room, doctors and nurses started to shout and scream for help. A few nurses ran out of the room, witnessing their colleagues randomly collapse in such quick succession, triggered anxiety and sparked fear they could be next. The hospital alarms were quickly raised, and an announcement from the intercom rang through the hospital, asking all available patients and staff who could do so, to begin evacuating the hospital immediately. Only a handful of medical staff remained, very brave staff members who stayed behind to assist with continuing to treat Gloria, as her life was hanging in the balance, and they were desperate to save her. They believed evacuating her at the time would have done more harm than good. As the hospital broke out into chaos, as news swiftly got around that a mysterious illness had broken out within the hospital walls, causing anyone who came into contact with it to black out, no one knew what it was, and no one wanted to be its next target. The hospital parking lot quickly filled up with patients and hospital staff. It was a very chaotic scene, with police and ambulance sirens blaring, screams from frightened patients not knowing what was going on, medical staff scrambling to source supplies for those in need, and the hospital being sectioned off by a team of experts in full hazmat suits. It looked like a scene from a horror movie. Unfortunately, the team that remained in the hospital working on Gloria were not finding much success, as they continued to administer drugs and pump her full of oxygen. It would appear the harder they tried, the fainter her heartbeat got, and lower her blood pressure dropped. Roughly 45 minutes after Gloria was wheeled into Riverside Hospital on February 19, 1994. She would sadly go on to be pronounced dead. But what was the cause of all this anarchy? What was it about Gloria that caused all those around her to suddenly become sick or lose consciousness? To answer that, we must take a few steps back. You see, Gloria was a mother of two beautiful children, who were her world. She absolutely adored them, being the family-orientated woman she was. When she got the news that she had terminal cancer, although she was frightened for herself, she was more devastated at the prospect of leaving her two girls behind, especially at such a tender age. As soon as the dust had settled, and the gravity of the situation had sunken in, Gloria decided she was going to do everything in her power to be around for her kids. She came across a medication called dimethyl sulfoxide, or DSMO for short. Although not widely prescribed nowadays, in the mid-20th century, it was often prescribed to treat inflammation, limb pain, cancer and chemotherapy side effects. Specifically, it was often praised for its ability to be easily absorbed by the skin. However, the more popular DSMO got, future government testing would reveal that the side effects associated with the medication were not worth the risk. So, they banned it from pharmacies. Initially, this news upset Gloria, but as determined as Gloria was to survive, with a bit more research, she would go on to learn that DSMO was still being used as an ingredient of a degreaser, which could easily be found in a wide range of local DIY stores. So, with this newfound knowledge, Gloria immediately went to her local store and bought several tubs of the heavy-duty degreaser. She would use it regularly, rubbing it in her so assist in her battle with cancer. And this would go on to explain the garlic odor the medical staff could smell, as DSMO causes your body to emit a garlic odor, both orally and through your pores as you sweat. Now, typically speaking, no matter how much of the degreaser Gloria rubbed onto her skin, she should have been relatively safe, as the human body would naturally flush the chemicals out of her body before they could reach dangerous levels. The following four events are what caused the life-changing devastation that would unfold at Riverside Hospital on that fateful day. Event number 1, Gloria's kidneys not working properly due to the infection, meant that the chemicals contained in the DSMO she had been rubbing onto her body were not flushing out, thus building to unsafe levels. Event number 2, when the medical staff applied the oxygen mask to Gloria's face, this mixed with the DSMO chemicals, changing their properties completely. The increased oxygen sped up the rate of her blood flow, pushing this newly formed chemical all around Gloria's body. Event number 3, when the medical staff began to use the defibrillator, sending electrical charges through her body. Once again, the electricity interacted with the newfound chemical within Gloria, but this time, it made it deadly. Gloria's body had now essentially become a human canister, a bomb filled with a dangerous nerve gas called dimethyl sulfide. This was very toxic to anyone who would happen to come into contact with it. However, although the dangerous toxins were now incubating in the patient's body, it was event number 4 that triggered the calamity that was to come. You see, while dimethyl sulfide was confined to Gloria's body, it wouldn't pose a threat to her or anyone around her, as her core temperature was too hot for it to stabilize. The moment the nurse drew blood from the patient's arm, the cool temperature of trauma room 1 would allow the chemical to stabilize, where it turned into a lethal gas and became airborne. Thus, the perfect recipe for disaster. A total of 23 staff members took sick while treating Gloria, They had to be treated for various symptoms. But out of all the hospital staff that took sick, Julie was by far the worst affected. She had the most severe symptoms, as when she woke up, she found herself in an intensive care unit, unable to move her legs and arms. She had an inability to string a sentence together. She was also diagnosed with pancreatitis, a painful inflammation of the pancreas. On top of this, Julie was diagnosed with vascular necrosis of the knees, which translates to knees deterioration of her knee bones, caused by lack of blood circulation. Julie had undergone operations for this. She once said in an interview, "It was the worst pain I'd been in my life." Julie is grateful to have survived the incident, but until this day, still claims she hasn't felt 100% since. Gloria's family would go on to sue the hospital. The hospital has always denied any wrongdoing. However, they ended up reaching a settlement with the family for a sum of $800,000. I hope Gloria's family have found peace and healing. And there you have it, the story of the woman dubbed the Toxic Lady. But we know she was so much more than that. She was a daughter, a partner, a mother, an inspiration, a beautiful loving human being, who was loved by many. May Gloria's soul rest in eternal peace. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. Also leave your thoughts in the comment section below. Keep in mind, these are real people, with real loved ones, so until next